Okay, so this is the Module 4 PowerPoint. This is actually going to cover 3 chapters. Chapter 7 on the heart and the blood vessels, Chapter 8 on the blood, and Chapter 10 on the respiratory system. And they all kind of fit together, so that's one of the reasons why they kind of go together well for this week. Chapter 7 talks about the structure of heart and blood vessels, and the function of the heart is to pump blood through the body. So it fits well with Chapter 8, then talking about the components of blood. One of the components of blood is red blood cells that carry oxygen, and that oxygen is inhaled and breathed in through the lungs. So there's a lot that fits together through these 3 chapters. When we talk about the heart, we're going to first talk about the pathway of blood flow through the heart. Then we're going to talk about the contraction events in the heart. Those contraction events are stimulated by electrical events, action potentials in the heart. And then the cardiac cycle kind of ties all of that together. So it's going to be a really good way to kind of review at the end of this section of the lecture to use the cardiac cycle. But there's a lot to that cardiac cycle, so we could just go through the cardiac cycle and that would tell us all the events that happen in the heart. But by kind of going through it in a more stepwise way, we can kind of pick up some of the pieces that we need and then put it together in looking at that cardiac cycle. So we'll first start by looking at the outside of the heart, the surface anatomy of the heart, and then we'll start to look at the structures on the inside. When you first look at the heart, it's made of 4 chambers. The 2 at the top are called the atria or atrium. There's one on the right and one on the left, so there's a right atrium and a left atrium. The chambers on the bottom are the ventricles. So you have a right ventricle and a left ventricle. And then all the blood vessels enter and leave from the top of the heart. The vessels that bring blood into the heart, on the right side is the vena cava, and on the left side is the pulmonary vein. And the vessels that bring blood away from the heart, on the right side is the pulmonary artery, and on the left side is the aorta. And we'll talk more about those vessels as we talk about this pathway of blood flow through the heart. Now, I want to mention quickly about right and left. When we talk about right and left refer to the subject or the patient or the model or the figure's anatomy, not your right and left. So when you look at these figures, it might be switched from your right and left because we're talking about the right and left side of this heart, the right and left side of this person, the right and left side of this structure. So please don't let that be confusing for you. So here's a figure from your book, and it shows the atria. The atria are these small chambers at the top of the heart. And then it shows the ventricles. The ventricles are these larger chambers at the bottom of the heart. The entire heart is a muscle. It has cardiac muscle in the wall of this heart. And so you can see some of the kind of striations that they're showing you. There's a lot of blood vessels on the surface of the heart, but there's some major vessels that bring blood into the heart, like the vena cava. And there's some major vessels that lead away from the heart, like the aorta and the pulmonary arteries. Now, when you look at the heart in the human body, it's actually twisted slightly. We don't look at it straight on. It's actually angled a little bit or turned a little bit so that the front surface or the anterior surface of the heart that we see a lot more of this left ventricle than we do this right ventricle. Sorry, I said that completely backwards. As soon as that came out, I was like, that didn't sound right. So the anterior surface of the heart has a lot more of this right ventricle than we see of the left ventricle. That time I said it correctly. So when we look at the flow of blood through the heart is a double-sided pump. The function of the heart is to pump blood to different parts of the body. The heart has a right side and the heart has a left side. Blood comes into the right side of the heart and goes out to the lungs. Blood comes into the left side of the heart and goes to the body. Blood never goes from the right side of the heart to the left side of the heart without first leaving the heart and going through blood vessels. So blood never goes from the right atrium to the left atrium. Blood never goes from the left atrium to the right atrium. It will go from the right atrium to the right ventricle and out. It'll go from the left atrium to the left ventricle and out. But blood flows through each side of the heart to be circulated. So now we can look at the heart in cross-section, and it's showing you some arrows to show you this pattern of blood flow through the heart. So if we start on the right side, there's a vein called the vena cava. It has a section called the superior vena cava, and that's receiving blood from all of the upper extremities. And then the inferior vena cava is receiving blood from all of the lower extremities. And so this blood from the vena cava flows into the right atrium. Blood always is received in the heart in the atria, in the top chambers of the heart. The term vena cava is actually Latin for cavernous vein or big vein. This is the largest vein in the body, and it carries all of the blood from all of the parts of the body back into the heart. Blood will then flow from this right atrium into the ventricle. From the ventricle, blood will get pumped to the lungs. So it goes into a vessel called the pulmonary artery to go to the lungs. So on the right side of the heart, blood comes from the body and blood goes to the lungs. On the left side of the heart, blood again comes into the atria from veins called pulmonary veins, and it comes into this left atrium. It then goes into this left ventricle, and it gets pumped out by a big artery called the aorta. On the left side of the heart, blood is coming from the lungs and going to the body. So when we think about it, the pattern of blood flow actually kind of resembles a figure 8. Blood enters the right atrium from the body and leaves the right ventricle for the lungs. Blood enters the left atrium from the lungs and leaves the left ventricle for the body. Sometimes when we talk about going to the lungs to pick up oxygen, that's called pulmonary circulation. Pulmonary refers to lungs. So the pulmonary circulation is going to the lungs and coming back. Sometimes when we talk about the circulation through the body or all the body systems, that's called systemic circulation. So you may hear pulmonary and systemic circulation. But what we're talking about there, when we talk about the pulmonary circulation, we're talking about going to and coming back from the lungs. Talk about systemic circulation, we talk about going to and coming back from the body. So on the right side of the heart, again, we're receiving blood from the body and sending it to the lungs. Then the left side of the heart receives from the lungs and sends to the body. So it does form kind of a figure eight. It does kind of form a loop. Often, books will refer to deoxygenated blood by showing structures in blue or showing the blood as blue. And they will show oxygenated blood by showing structures as red or showing arrows as red. And this figure is no different. So when the blood comes back from the body, all the oxygen has been used. All the oxygen has been used by the body systems. All the oxygen has been used up by those tissues. So when blood comes from the body, it doesn't have any oxygen anymore. It's been deoxygenated. Let's do that in blue. And so they show you all of these arrows of this deoxygenated blood in blue. And that sometimes helps us to remember that it's coming from the body and it's headed to the lungs. It's got to go to the lungs to pick up oxygen. Then once it comes back from the lungs, it has oxygen. And so now the arrows are being shown in red. Now the blood is being shown in red. It's coming from the lungs, it's freshly oxygenated, and it goes into these large arteries like the aorta to be pumped to the whole body. This figure also helps with that, and it shows the red and the blue, and it shows you the lungs. So blood coming from the systemic circuit or from the body comes into the right atrium and leaves by those pulmonary arteries, and it goes to the lungs where it picks up oxygen. And now this oxygenated blood comes back in the left side of the heart and goes out through arteries that will send it to the whole body. So this is showing you the pulmonary circuit of blood flow and how it fits with the pattern of blood flow through the heart. So now if we go back even to this first figure we looked at, some of the coloring in this figure now makes a little bit of sense. This blue superior and inferior vena cava coming into the right atrium is bringing that deoxygenated blood. And that deoxygenated blood is going to come back out these pulmonary arteries. But once it has picked up blood at the lungs and it comes back in these pulmonary veins, and there's even another pulmonary vein way on the back side of the heart over here that you don't see. That's the right pulmonary veins. So there are right and left pulmonary veins. They both lead into this left atrium, and then blood goes through the interior of the heart and leaves through this aorta, which branches off into these other vessels, which branch and branch and branch and carry blood through the whole body. But you can see how looking at this surface picture, it's really hard to get an idea of that. So then we look at this cross-sectional figure, and that helps to present the chambers and to help us with the flow just a little bit. Now, if you look at that figure 7-3 and you look at the wall of the left ventricle, you see that the left ventricle has the thickest muscular wall of all the chambers of the heart, and it's even thicker than the right ventricle. The right ventricle just has to pump blood to the lungs. Very close. The lungs kind of wrap around the heart. They're just right next door. The left ventricle has to pump blood through the whole body, top of the head, bottoms of the feet, tips of the toes, and back. So it needs a lot of pumping force, and therefore it has that thick muscular wall. So when I was first learning the flow of blood through the heart, I remembered this one piece of information, and it helped me figure everything else out. If you can remember that left ventricle is where it's thick, and that's sending it to the body, you can figure out all the other three pieces. So if you know the left ventricle is sending blood to the body, that left side of the heart must have received blood from the lungs. So if the left side received from the lungs, the right side must have received from the body and sent the blood to the lungs. So this was what helped me try to remember that pattern of blood flow through the heart. Remembering that left ventricle was the side that had that thick muscular wall because of the systemic circulation helped me to try to piece out all of the other pieces. Now, the other structure that we haven't talked about yet that we can start to talk about are structures called valves. There are valves in the heart that prevent backflow. So this flow of blood is unidirectional. This is a one-way flow of blood. Blood enters the two chambers at the top of the heart. Atrium is singular, atria is plural. Blood flows through a valve into the ventricle. Now, the name of this valve is pretty easy. The valve between the atria and the ventricle is called the AV valve. The valve between the A and the V is the AV valve. Now, there's some other terms for this valve that you may hear. On the right side of the heart, it's called the tricuspid valve because it has three cusps. On the left side of the heart, it's called the bicuspid valve because that valve has two cusps or flaps that come together. That bicuspid valve is sometimes also called the mitral valve. So on the left side of the heart, you have that bicuspid valve or the mitral valve. And on the right side of the heart, it's the tricuspid valve. And then another set of valves that we are going to talk about are the ones that lead from the ventricles. And those are called semilunar valves because they apparently look like a half moon to somebody that looked at them originally. The one that goes into the pulmonary veins are the pulmonary semilunar valves. The ones that lead into the aorta is the aortic semilunar valve. So in between the atrium and the ventricle, there is a valve. In between the A and the V is the AV valve. On the left side of the heart, that's called the left AV valve. On the right side of the heart, that's the right AV valve. And that's an accurate term for it, even though it's easy to remember. Most of our terms are not easy to remember. But you may hear that term mitral valve if you've ever heard of someone with a mitral valve prolapse that had to have a mitral valve replacement. That mitral valve is there on the left side of the heart. So that's why I also wanted to use that term. And then the valves that are going into the arteries are the semilunar valves. This is the pulmonary semilunar valve that's going into the pulmonary arteries. And then here is the aortic semilunar valve going into the aorta. And so the pulmonary valve goes into the pulmonary artery. The aortic valve goes into the aorta. So this terminology kind of makes the valves based on the vessels that they're leading into. And the last little bit that might help is to learn a little bit about arteries and veins. Now, later in this chapter, your book talks a little bit about the difference between arteries and veins, but it's kind of helpful for what this part is talking about to try to help remember some of these parts of the heart. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. Arteries away. So arteries carry blood away from the heart, and veins return blood back to the heart. So veins lead toward the heart. And then many books show that oxygenated blood is red and deoxygenated blood is blue. You cannot rely on the red and blue to tell arteries from veins. Not all arteries carry oxygenated blood, particularly the pulmonary arteries. So if you're trying to remember a rule of thumb, you can't use the red and blue, but you can remember that arteries carry blood away from the heart and veins return blood toward the heart. So the red and blue won't always help, but the arteries away will help you. So now we've got all of the pieces, we can go back and look at blood flow through the heart. So veins carry blood toward the heart. Green. Veins carry blood back toward the heart. So this vena cava comes into the heart. And where does blood come into the heart? Blood comes into the atria. So from those veins, blood goes into the atrium, goes through the AV valve to the ventricle, goes through a semilunar valve to an artery. The other side is no different. Vein, atria, AV valve, ventricle, semilunar valve, artery. If we're on the left side with this thick wall, this thick muscular wall that's sending things to the systemic circulation, that artery is called the aorta. If we're on the right side that doesn't have as thick of a wall, that artery is a pulmonary artery and it's just taking blood to the lungs. So the pattern is going to be the same. Veins lead into the atria. Blood goes through the valves into the ventricles, through valves into arteries that carry blood away from the heart. And if you can remember, the right side goes to the lungs. That tells you the pulmonary arteries. If you can remember, the left side goes to the body. That tells you aorta. Then once blood leaves that aorta, so here's the aortic arch right here, the arteries that lead out of the heart divide and divide and divide to carry blood to all parts of the body. And you'll see in this figure that arteries and veins are located in very similar areas because once the blood gets into the tissue and that oxygen gets used, the veins have to carry the blood back toward the heart so that it can go to the lungs and pick up oxygen and start the whole cycle again. So then we can move on and talk about what causes the contraction of the heart that causes the pumping of this blood. And what causes contraction are electrical events like action potentials. So if you remember anything about the action potential of skeletal muscle, the same thing happens in cardiac muscle. Sodium channels open, sodium diffuses down its concentration gradient, and that causes depolarization. Cells in cardiac muscle are connected by something called gap junctions, so that sodium can diffuse into adjacent cells. So a whole wave of depolarization goes over the atrium of the heart, and that causes it to contract. And that depolarization continues and spreads over the ventricle of the heart and causes that chamber to contract. It's the same mechanism that we previously studied. A wave of depolarization or an action potential goes through the muscle cell membrane and causes the release of calcium. Uses the same molecules. Calcium binds to troponin, moves tropomyosin out of the way. Myosin and actin slide filaments relative to one another. That's why we studied that chapter in so much detail, because now we can just say it happens the same way. So the piece that we have to add on to it is the specific structures in the heart. I've listed them for you here, and then we look at them on the next slide. There's the SA node. SA means sinoatrial, so that tells you it's in the atrium. The AV node is in between the atrium and the ventricle. And then there are fibers. There are branches of fibers called bundle branches, and then there are Purkinje fibers that help to spread that electrical potential through the ventricle. And so here they're showing you these blue fibers. They're showing you the SA node. It's connected to this AV node. There are these bundle branches that go down this area in between the ventricles. It's called the interventricular septum. And then these Purkinje fibers spread throughout the ventricles. And so this wave of depolarization can first go over the atria and cause the atria to contract, and then can go through the ventricles and cause the ventricles to contract. And I want to give you two additional terms. One is systole. Systole is contraction of the heart muscle. And the other is diastole, which is relaxation of the heart muscle. And so we sometimes talk about systolic and diastolic blood pressure. These are the terms for contraction and relaxation of the chambers of the heart. So I have an animation that I want to show you. I'm going to push out a link to you. So another website should have opened for you that's showing an animation called the conducting system of the heart. When you're ready to look at that animation, all you have to do is press the play button, and it will play for you. If you don't have your speakers on, you can read the words, because the words that are there are the same as what the narrator is speaking. I really like this animation because if you're a visual person, you can look at the animation, and it helps you. If you're a verbal person and you want to read, you can read the caption, and it'll tell you what's happening. If you're more of an auditory person, put on headphones, close your eyes if you think the animation is confusing. So I have another website. If you had that same window still open, just minimize. It might open the cardiac. Some of these things that we're talking about the and that's the link that I just pushed out to you right there. So then your book the heart. So they show you some things about the structure of arteries and veins. A couple of differences between arteries and veins that I want to point out to you. So that if you're asked a question like, can you compare and contrast the structure of an artery and a vein? That means point out some similarities and some differences. Here's some differences. The artery, a lot of elastic tissue. That allows the artery to expand as blood gets pumped into those arteries from the heart. Because again, that left ventricle has to get up a lot of pressure to force that blood out so that it can go through the whole circulation. And so the arteries that come off the heart, the arteries that are closest to the heart, get blood very forcefully. And they have to be able to expand and contract without breaking or leaking blood. And so they have these layers of elastic tissue. Arterioles have a lot of smooth muscle in them. So arterioles can change their diameter. And arterioles are one of the blood vessels that are involved in like thermoregulation, like we talked about in the skin. When blood vessels change their diameter, vasodilation and vasoconstriction, a lot of that is due to arterioles. Arteries become smaller and smaller and become small arterioles. Arterioles lead into capillaries. We'll see that here in just a few moments. Capillaries are very small and they only have one cell layer that make up their wall. There's only a single layer of endothelial cells that make up a capillary. Then they lead into venules, and they lead into veins, which lead back to the heart. Now, veins have none of that elastic tissue that was in arteries, and veins have structures called valves, similar to the valves in the heart. They have a very similar function to help blood flow in one way through the vein to get the blood back to the heart. So we're going to talk about some things related to blood vessels. One of the things we can talk about is blood pressure. Fluids exert pressure against the walls of their container, and blood is no different. Blood is a fluid, and it exerts pressure against the walls of the blood vessel. Blood pressure is very high in the arteries closest to the heart, as we just discussed. then if you look at the figure, blood pressure has these wide swings in these elastic. Blood pressure drops across the capillary bed and in the venules, and blood pressure is much lower in veins than it was in arteries. So that's why arteries need that elastic tissue to be able to accommodate this high pressure due to the heart pumping. But the heart has to pump that much to get blood all the way through the arteries, the arterioles, the capillaries, the venules, and the veins, where the pressure is really, really low when it comes back to the heart. Now, there will be another PowerPoint that will talk a little bit more about blood pressure in more detail, and I'm going to do another WIMBA presentation on that to do an archive, a recording on that. I think that might give you some more information as you're working on your assignment for this week. So I'll be sure and post an announcement when I have those two things out, but I think those will help you with your discussion board question that you're working on this week. Now, as I said, veins have valves to help blood flow get back to the heart. There's very low pressure in those veins, so veins have valves. The skeletal muscle pump helps with that. We're going to see that in the next figure. And then the respiratory pump helps with that. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the next chapter. So this figure 714 shows how the skeletal muscles help the blood flow back to the heart and veins by using the valve. So with this valve closed, blood can pool here, and then as this muscle contracts, that forces the blood into the next segment of the vein, and then that valve can close and prevent backflow of the blood. So the valve prevents a backflow, and the squeezing or the contraction of the skeletal muscle helps to propel blood forward through the veins. Capillary beds are branching of these small capillaries, these very small blood vessels. I have two animations to show you about capillary beds. The first is about blood flow in capillaries. This one's big, so it takes a second to download. Okay. Perhaps I'll show you the other one. Oops, not found. Okay, so I have two animations that I'm going to post in the Blackboard file. They're both shockwave files, so if you have shockwave or flash, then you can watch them. Just open up an Internet Explorer browser. The first one is called Blood Flow in Capillaries, and it takes a YouTube video, and I actually pause it and kind of explain what you're seeing in the YouTube video. So the YouTube video is linked in that folder of animations, and I'm going to put this blood flow in capillaries animation right underneath it. And the only thing that my animation adds is a little bit of explanation of what you're looking at in the YouTube video. And then the second animation I'm going to add is one called capillary bed animation that's going to show you some of the things related to the capillary bed. Okay, well, there's the capillary flow animation. But I'm just going to post that on Blackboard and let you take a look at it on Blackboard. The second animation that I'm referring to, the capillary bed animation, is going to look pretty similar to this figure from your book. All it does is it animates for you what happens when you open and close these precapillary sphincters. These precapillary sphincters are bands of smooth muscle cells, and so we can open them to permit blood flow through this whole capillary bed, or we can close them to just shunt blood through the capillary bed. There's a couple of different situations in which you might want to do things like that. For instance, if there's a part of the lung that is damaged, you don't want to take the time and the energy to have all this perfusion of blood if there's not enough oxygen there to pick up. You're going to want to shunt the blood to an area of the lungs where there is enough oxygen to pick up. Surrounding the stomach. When you've eaten a meal, you want to dilate those blood vessels to pick up as much nutrients as possible. But if you haven't eaten in a while, those precapillary sphincters can shut down so that you don't have to have that force of getting the blood through that capillary bed to pick up nutrients that aren't even there. So that animation just kind of animates this figure 717 from your book and just shows you visually what happens when you open and close those precapillary sphincters. So figure 8 starts to talk about blood and some things related to blood and components of blood. There's essentially 3 components of blood. I'll let you read that on your own. I'm going to go through this part a little bit quickly. This is a false colored electron micrograph that shows the 3 types of components of cells in blood. It shows red blood cells, it shows white blood cells, and it shows fragments of cells called platelets that help with blood clotting. And then this is a figure that tells you a lot of the things that's in the cellular portion and the plasma portion of blood. Now, blood cells form from a stem cell called a pluripotent stem cell. Potent from the same root as potential, and pluri meaning multiple from the same root as the word plural. So this has plural potential. It has a multiple potential. This cell has the potential to become lots of different cell types. The first step is it differentiates into a lymphoid stem cell and a myeloid stem cell. And then it can go through other growth and differentiation steps. And we're going to see an example of that in just a minute looking at erythropoietin. So this is the figure from your book. Here's your pluripotent stem cell. This cell has the potential to become a platelet or a red blood cell or a granulocyte, which is any of these 3 kind of cells, or a monocyte or a lymphocyte, which is either of these 2 kind of cells. This cell can become any of these cell types. What determines what type of cell this cell will become is the presence or absence of different growth factors or chemicals that help this process. The first step in becoming one of these cells is this pluripotent stem cell differentiates either into a myeloid stem cell or to a lymphoid stem cell. And so this is the first step to being committed down one of these pathways. Now, the myeloid stem cell can still become platelets or basophils or eosinophils or neutrophils or monocytes. But a myeloid stem cell cannot become a lymphocyte. So that's the first step toward becoming one of these specific cell types, is to differentiate either into this myeloid stem cell pathway or this lymphoid stem cell pathway. Then from this myeloid stem cell, this cell can become something called a megakaryocyte. And a megakaryocyte can only become platelets. So once this cell has become a megakaryocyte, it can't become an erythrocyte, it can't become a neutrophil, it can't become a monocyte. It could become a granulocyte colony, which could eventually become one of these three granulocytes. It could become an erythrocyte precursor, which could eventually become an erythrocyte. Or it could become a monocyte precursor, which can become a monocyte. But again, this monocyte precursor can't ever become a platelet. There's no chance it'll become a platelet. Now, I forgot to mention when I started explaining this figure, the typo that's in the figure. I meant to do that for you guys because I noticed it when I was putting this PowerPoint together, and I totally forgot. This granulocyte precursor can become one of these granulocytes. This erythrocyte precursor can become an erythrocyte. They show you the picture here of the erythrocyte. They tell you erythrocyte precursor here. Just that box is what was incorrect. They show you the three granulocytes here. They tell you granulocyte precursor here. It's just that box that's incorrect. It's just those two boxes that are switched. And I meant to point that out before I started explaining the figure because I didn't want you to get confused. So I'll run through it again kind of quick. So let me put our correct labels. Okay. So this pluripotent stem cell can become any of our cell types. Can become platelets, can become basophils or eosinophils or neutrophils or erythrocytes or monocytes or either type of lymphocyte. And so that's what it means by pluripotent. It has a multiple potential. It has the potential to become any of these cells. So this cell divides and makes more copies of itself. And any of those copies of itself can become any of these types of cells. And the first step toward commitment toward a pathway is to either become a myeloid stem cell or a lymphoid stem cell. That's the first thing that kind of divides which cell it can be. It's either going to be on this right-hand side or it's going to be on this left-hand side. And then from that stem cell, it can differentiate into another type of a precursor cell, which further narrows the type that it can be. So if it becomes this granulocyte precursor, it could either become a basophil or an eosinophil or a neutrophil, one of our three types of granulocytes. But it could not become a monocyte or an erythrocyte or a platelet. From this myeloid stem cell, once it's committed to being a monocyte precursor, it can never be a red blood cell. And what determines what type of cell these stem cells become is the presence of certain growth factors. So here's an example using erythropoietin, which is a growth factor for red blood cells. This is an example of homeostasis. So we've mentioned some things about homeostasis. This is one aspect of homeostasis related to the cardiovascular system, related to blood. So this homeostatic mechanism occurs when the kidneys detect that there's not enough oxygen in the blood. The function of red blood cells is to carry oxygen in the blood. If the kidneys detect there's not enough oxygen in the blood, the kidney secretes a hormone or a growth factor called erythropoietin. So when they sense that decreased oxygen, they secrete this hormone erythropoietin. Erythropoietin then stimulates production of red blood cells, and so now you can have more oxygen in the blood. And so this makes sense if you think about the kidney senses you don't have enough oxygen. It secretes a hormone that makes the cells that carry oxygen, so now your blood can carry more oxygen. And so they show it to you in a circle like this because it's a feedback loop. It's a negative feedback loop. You get a change that's bad for the body, less oxygen, and so your body goes through homeostasis to bring it back to normal. This is similar to when we talked about body temperature regulation. You get a change, body temperature falls, and your body does something to bring it back up to normal. Here, oxygen falls, and your body does something to bring it back up to normal. And so erythropoietin is a hormone that can make that myeloid stem cell become an erythrocyte precursor and develop into an erythrocyte. Red blood cells have a large amount of hemoglobin. We've talked briefly about hemoglobin. It has 4 protein chains and 4 heme groups. The heme groups are what carry oxygen. The proteins carry carbon dioxide. So the red blood cells can carry the gases through the bloodstream. I'm going to talk a little bit about ABO blood groups in just a minute. I just want to make sure that I talk a little bit about some things related to white blood cells here for just a second. There are actually 5 kinds of white blood cells that we can talk about when we talk about white blood cells. Neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. Now, the neutrophils, the eosinophils, and the basophils are those granulocytes. The neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils, and monocytes can come from that myeloid stem cell. The lymphocytes come from a lymphoid stem cell. I've shown them to you here in decreasing order of prevalence in the bloodstream. So neutrophils are most numerous in the bloodstream, followed by lymphocytes, followed by monocytes. The mnemonic device that I always used when I was trying to remember this is never let monkeys eat bananas. That helps you, that phrase, never let monkeys eat bananas, helps you remember them in this order of prevalence. So N is for neutrophils, that's the most prevalent. So if you're ever asked what's the most prevalent white blood cell in the bloodstream, you can think, never let monkeys eat bananas, N, neutrophil. The one that you find the least, never let monkeys eat bananas, B, basophils. Are there more monocytes or eosinophils in the bloodstream? Never let monkeys eat bananas. There's more monocytes. So I wanted to make sure and point out that little memory device because that's often helpful to people. Now, the last thing that your chapter talks about is related to blood groups and blood typing. So I wanted to go through and talk about blood groups and blood typing just a little bit. Red blood cells have proteins on their surface called antigens. These are genetically determined proteins found on red blood cell surfaces. We put people into blood groups, or we say what their blood type is, based on whether or not they have these various antigens, based on the presence or absence of these various antigens. When we give somebody a transfusion, we want to avoid an interaction between that protein and the antibodies of their immune system. So that's why we talk about compatibility for transfusion. We're trying to avoid interacting a protein with an antibody. There are a lot of different blood groups and antigens. Your book gives you a table of them. The one that we use most commonly is the ABO and the RH blood groups, so those are the only two that I'm really going to talk about. We'll talk about ABO blood groups first, and then we'll talk about RH blood groups. So let me talk a little bit about antibodies for just a second. Antibodies are your immune system in response to anything your immune system thinks is foreign. So when your immune system develops, your immune system starts to learn what is self. What are the parts of you that are okay to be there? So anything that's not self, non-self, it recognizes as foreign. And it will make antibodies that interact with time. person with type A blood so they can receive their body thinks B is foreign. Because their body thinks type B blood has the B antigen. So that immune system would recognize type A blood or the A antigen as foreign. This person can receive type B blood or they can receive type O blood. Type O blood cells don't have any protein in their red blood cell surface. So there are no proteins to trigger the immune system. Type AB has the A antigen and the B antigen. So there are no antigens that it sees as foreign. So it can receive type A blood. It can receive type B blood. It can receive type AB. It can receive type O. The person's blood does not have any antigens on its red blood cell surface. So its immune system would see both type A and type B as foreign. So the only thing that they can receive is blood that doesn't B is what we sometimes call as the universal recipient. And if you see that type O is in each one of these, that is why we tend to call type O the universal donor. That's also why if you don't know a person's blood type, you use type O blood because you know it won't elicit an antigen response because it doesn't have any antigens on its surface. So if you don't know someone's blood type, type O is the safest option. And this is a table from your book. Blood type refers to Rh antigen. Now this is just a single protein, so there's not two proteins. There's not an A and a B. There's just a single protein, the Rh protein or the Rh factor. And so, again, the blood type indicates the presence or absence of the antigens on that red blood cell surface. But here, rather than saying A when you have the A and B when you have the B, here we just say positive or negative if you have this one protein. So that's the plus or the minus or the positive or negative that goes along with your blood type. If you have protein, then we say your blood type is positive. If you don't have this protein, we say your blood type is. Now, just like with the A and the B, if you grew up with having that protein, it recognizes it as self, and there's no problem. But if you didn't, if your immune system didn't grow up seeing that protein, if you don't have it on your red blood cells, your body will recognize it as foreign. And so positive blood has that antigen. Negative blood does not have the antigen, and so the Rh negative immune system would recognize it as foreign. Where this usually comes into issue is in something called hemolytic disease. Hemolytic disease of the newborn occurs if you have a Rh negative mother and an Rh positive fetus. The Rh negative mother recognizes that Rh protein as foreign and makes antibodies. If she has a second Rh positive baby, the antibodies could interfere with the pregnancy. This will only happen if you have an Rh negative mother and an Rh positive father. If the mother was Rh positive, she wouldn't recognize. There's no gene there for the Rh protein, and the fetus wouldn't be Rh. So we're looking at a situation negative mother. Blood, and her body encounters that Rh positive blood, she makes those Rh antibodies. And then those antibodies could really wreak havoc on subsequent Rh positive fetus. There are drugs that they have developed to try to block that interaction. Rogam is a drug that you may have heard of. They give it in shot form. Often what they will do now is if the mother is Rh negative, they'll just go ahead and give her Rogam. They don't even care what the father is. It's inexpensive, it's easy, there's very little risk, and it's being wrong. And so a lot of times if you're an Rh negative mother, they'll give Rogam fairly standardly. And it's for that reason to try to prevent making antibodies that will interfere with the fetus. Together, that makes up whatever your blood type is. So if your blood type is A positive, that means you have the A antigen and you have the Rh antigen on your red blood cells. If you're AB negative, that means you have the A antigen and the B antigen, not the Rh antigen. You could be O positive or you could be O negative. O positive means you have the Rh, but you don't have the O. O negative means that you don't have either of those proteins. So you can have any combination of the AB proteins and the Rh proteins, and that puts together what we currently refer to as our blood type that we look at these days. And then chapter 10 goes into respiratory system. This is pretty straightforward. There's not a lot in the PowerPoint because there's not. I just wanted to try to tie some things about the respiratory system to what we've already talked about blood and about the heart. The heart pumps blood, pumps it to the lungs and back again. red blood cells have hemoglobin that carry oxygen. That goes through capillaries to get it to the tissues. So the only piece of that we're missing is what happens in the lungs to get air into the lungs, to get oxygenated air into the lungs. So we breathe air in through the nasal cavity and the oral cavity. It goes down a tube called the trachea. One caveat here. It's very easy to get the trachea mixed up with another tube that goes down the body called the esophagus. Do not confuse the trachea with the esophagus. Esophagus is not in the respiratory system. Esophagus is in the digestive system. Trachea is in the respiratory. Esophagus is in the digestive. Trachea is in the respiratory. Esophagus is in the digestive. And I'll remind everybody of that also when we get into the digestive system. Okay, so we breathe air in either through the nose or the mouth, and it goes down through the trachea. The trachea divides into two bronchi, and that leads to the right lung and the left lung. Those bronchi subdivide into little bronchioles, and they eventually terminate in an alveolar sac, which are these little grape-like clusters of air sacs. This shows you a little bit closer view, but what I like about this is it shows capillaries. It's showing you a capillary bed surrounding each of these air sacs. So here's where our blood vessels come to get oxygen. We have that pulmonary artery that divides into arterioles. It gets down to these capillaries. It picks up oxygen, and it goes back into the pulmonary vein. This is one of those places where it's reversed, where the arteries have deoxygenated blood and the veins have oxygenated blood, because here we're picking up oxygen at the lungs. It seems a little bit counterintuitive, but inhalation is the part where you contract muscles. A lot of people think you contract your muscles to push air out, and that is not the case. For relaxed breathing, inhalation is the step that requires muscle contraction. Exhalation occurs by muscle relaxation. When you contract muscles like the diaphragm and some muscles called intercostal muscles that are in between the ribs, when you contract those muscles, that increases the volume of the chest cavity. That causes the pressure to drop, and that sucks air into the chest cavity. This is the respiratory pump that helps to pull blood toward the chest cavity. And then just letting that go back to normal decreases the volume of the chest cavity. That causes the pressure to push the air out of the chest. And so they're showing you that in this figure. The diaphragm contracts and moves downward. The intercostal muscles contract. That opens that rib cage up. Lung volume expands. And then you relax those muscles. The elastic fibers in the walls of the lungs passively recoil, and that pushes air out. If we go back to this figure that looks at blood vessels around these alveolar sacs, if we cut them open, this is what that looks like. And so these capillaries that surround these alveolar sacs, now this has been cut in cross-section. So we can see this blood vessel has been cut in cross-section so we can see the red blood cells. And you can see that capillary is really only big enough for a red blood cell. That puts the membrane of the red blood cell very close to the wall of this alveolus. There's not very much space at all between the wall of this air sac and the wall of this capillary. And that very small space is referred to as the respiratory membrane. And they show you an arrow to the next part of the figure, which blows that up even more, which shows you that basically the layers you have are the endothelium of the capillary, a single basement membrane, and the epithelium of the air sac. And that's a very, very small space. So remember when we talked about tissues, we talked about simple squamous epithelium, a single layer. We said at the time that you'll find simple epithelium, particularly simple squamous epithelium, in areas where absorption or secretion occurs, like in the lungs. And so now we're seeing that. Now that we're studying the lungs, we're seeing this simple squamous epithelium that lines the lung is there so that we have the smallest distance for oxygen and carbon dioxide to diffuse. It makes it as easy as possible to get gases into and out of the body. So when we talked about diffusion, diffusion was movement of molecules down concentration gradient from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. It's the same for gas, like oxygen and carbon dioxide. They'll diffuse down their partial pressure gradient, which is similar to a concentration gradient. For gases, to figure out how much of a gas you have, because a lot of times you can't see gases. So when physicists are working with gases to figure out how much of a gas they have, they figure out its partial pressure. But it's still a measure of how much is there. It's still a measure of kind of the concentration of the gas. And the gas will move down its partial pressure gradient from an area of high partial pressure to an area of low partial pressure. This figure in your book is showing you some partial pressures. They're putting some numbers on it. So if this helps you with some quantities, then it might be helpful. So the blood coming out of the heart, this oxygenated blood that's coming out of the heart, the partial pressure of oxygen is at 100. But in the tissues, it's less than 40. So oxygen will diffuse down its partial pressure gradient and enter the tissues. Carbon dioxide, which is made by the cells when they do metabolism, is around 40, but it'll be higher than 45 in the tissues because the tissues are making carbon dioxide. And so CO2 will diffuse down its partial pressure gradient to get into the capillaries. So this is the actual driving force for gases to move into and out of the capillaries. If you remember that's just down their partial pressure gradient, then that'll help to make sense. And then it's going to be across this very small area, this very small, what we call the respiratory membrane, which is just basically two cell membranes and a basement membrane thick. So we started out by talking about how blood is pumped by the heart. It's pumped to the lungs to pick up oxygen and then to the body to circulate the oxygen. And so we started that part of blood flow through the heart with that piece of it. The oxygen is carried on heme groups on the hemoglobin in red blood cells. That's the function of red blood cells, is to carry oxygen through arteries, arterioles, to capillaries, to exchange that gas, and then through venules and veins back to the heart, to be pumped to the lungs, to exchange that gas again. At the capillary, we get gas exchange because of the pressure gradients of the gases. The capillary beds in the lungs pick up oxygen. The capillary beds in the tissues deliver oxygen. The capillary beds at the lungs deliver CO2 into those air sacs where we breathe it out. So I'm hoping that that helps to make some of the stuff in these 3 chapters make a little bit more sense. There will be a separate PowerPoint in Wimba that I'm going to work on this afternoon that might help with your discussion board prompt. That's going to go into a little bit more detail about control of blood pressure. And I will post an announcement as soon as that is up for everybody to take a look at. So as usual, email me or post if you have any questions. Thanks.